Be really interested to see how this plays out. It's, there are a lot of people who are just really keen to get them. And then I think when they suddenly realise, but wait a minute, if I take this to school, no one in the school is going to know how to use this.
Yeah, you hear about a new treatment.
And there's more coming.
Yeah.
There's such exciting stuff coming. There's sublingual adrenaline coming out in the next year or two. So another way of using adrenaline. There's whole new modalities of treatment for food allergy. It's an exciting time. And you should be applying similar things to food allergies. So for most people, my advice would be that you need to think about three things.
Hello and welcome back to Making Safe Podcast. So this year we've got some really exciting guests. We've got professors, dietitians, professionals, all within the allergy space. But just before I start, I've got two massive favours to ask for you guys. Please click that subscribe button. The more subscribers, the bigger guests we can get on the podcast. And the second favour being, we launched Trustana about 5 months ago to help the community find allergy-friendly restaurants, airlines, cruise ships and hotels. And if you get 30 seconds spare after the end of the podcast, add your allergy reviews, whether you had a really good experience eating out with an allergy or whether you had a really bad experience on an airline. We want to know about the reviews and we want to make it safer for the community when eating out and traveling. So your reviews really matter. Let's jump into the podcast. Adam Fox, absolute pleasure to have you back on the Making Safe podcast. It was actually back in 2023. The last time I joined on the podcast, and it was actually one of the most listened to episodes as well. So pleasure to have you back.
It feels like a lifetime ago. Yeah, but lovely to be here.
And you mentioned you recently come back from Guazhou Falls.
I have, yes. I was lucky enough to be invited to give a talk at a conference in somewhere called Curitiba, which I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of before. But it's a lovely city in Brazil, but an excellent opportunity to turn the trip into a proper holiday.
What kind of talk was you doing there?
So it was a conference that revolves around a large children's hospital in Curitiba that serves a big population in Brazil. And it's organised by a gastroenterologist colleague of mine who I've known for many years. He's got a big, long-standing interest in allergy. And he's particularly interested in allergic gut disease. And he did a lovely job of getting together a few of us from different parts of the world. So an allergy gastro colleague from New York, a specialist dietitian who's based in France, and myself. And we did a whole day together just talking about all aspects of overlap between gastroenterology and allergy. So eosinophilic gut disease, eosinophilic esophagitis, something that's become much important to us as allergists because it's a side effect that you very occasionally see in children who are being desensitized. So really fascinating. It's always fascinating to go and do that immersed in another country's healthcare system.
Is it really interesting to see the difference between...
It was really interesting, and because we've got a chance to be there for a little bit longer, I got a chance to look around the hospital properly, just see how medicine is practiced just that little bit different everywhere. And being Brazil, there's very strong US influences there, there's very strong European influences, and of course it's very much, they've made it their own. And I think one of the reflections is I think there's a little bit sometimes of complacency in British medicine that, we do it really, really well, whatever it is. And so I love it being taken out of my comfort zone and just seeing things where you sort of think, wow, they do this so much better than we do here. And in fairness, in a lot of areas, it's a developing country still. And although Curitiba itself seems to be a relatively affluent city, it covers areas that are desperately deprived, but there were some areas where their children's hospital did pretty much put our own facilities to shame, to be honest. Yeah.
Would you still say it's like the US is leading the way in some ways?
No, I don't think so particularly. I think there are some fundamental issues with the US healthcare system. Some of the perverse incentives that come out from the way that their healthcare is reimbursed mean that medicine, I think it's broadly acknowledged, it isn't necessarily practiced particularly well. There's a lot of over-investigation and over-diagnosis and over-medicalisation. But, of course, when it comes to the tech, they do very, very well. So we've got a lot to learn from them from that side of things. But I think what always strikes me is that when you go to places where resources restrained, like it is in the UK, but sometimes more so in other places, the innovation that they come up with in order to manage things in that context is always fascinating. It's something we can all learn from. And there are a number of things that were really striking as to looking around and thinking, wow, you've got all of this, and this is stuff that we struggle to get hold of. in the UK. How have you managed that? And just understanding how they manage their resources. So sometimes a little bit less, not always just about the way the medicine is practiced, but the way the hospitals are run. And just because of my own career, and I've had a fair bit of involvement in that side of things.
Kind of see both sides of the coin, yeah.
Absolutely, because of course it's not just about what you could do. It's how you go about managing your resource and what you prioritize, and how you ensure that everybody gets a decent access to that healthcare.
So what I just say, congrats on obviously setting up an allergy clinic. I mean, what was the journey and the story behind that?
Goodness, this is a really long story.
How long we're here for? Yeah.
I think the first conversations that we talked about setting up our own allergy clinic probably go back 10, 15 years. But I mean, my background is 25 years plus in the NHS, and always been completely committed to that model. And I was extremely lucky timing wise that in 2006 I had the opportunity to become the first paediatric allergy consultant at what was a very large established teaching hospital at Guy's and St Thomas's, just as they'd built the Evelina Children's Hospital, which essentially was a coming together of all of the disparate paediatric services across what was a very large NHS Foundation trust into one hospital. And at the same time, there was a recognition they had a large adult allergy service led by a guy called Tackley, who was an incredible guy who developed research and clinical services incredibly at Guy's Hospital, and they therefore had probably the largest adult allergy service in the country, but they recognised they didn't really have a paediatric service, and so he really set about doing something about that. And the way he did that is he wanted to attract both a large-scale research program as well as a clinical program. And so a very close colleague of mine and somebody who had trained me, Professor Gideon Lack, was already just at the early stages of running the LEAP study, which turned out to absolutely change allergy prevention globally. And George Dutoy, who was working with him on that, they came across predominantly on the research side. I came across on the clinical side, and we got to set up a service from scratch. Now, you don't often get to do that.
How many years ago was it when kind of the LEAP study that kind of started getting developed?
Well, if you ask Gideon, he'll tell you he was talking about it for many years before, because of course,
really?
These ideas are a long time in the making.
And then the kind of research was there that this could be possible.
Absolutely. So the sort of the research that led to the large trial, so gathering the evidence to support what was, very significant funding to run a study on the scale of the LEAP study takes years. And so that evidence had been in train from probably 5-10 years earlier, developing the number of studies looking at kids in different parts of the world who were more or less likely to develop peanut allergy based on what age they first got peanut in their weaning diet, things like that. But the study itself really kicked off in earnest sort of 2006-07. Just as we moved to St Thomas's. And it makes you realise, because I think the advice didn't change around early introduction of peanut till about 2015. So it makes you realise how long it takes. I mean, we imagine medical research and science things happen really, really quickly, but in fact, it doesn't. It's so hard to get these large-scale trials off the ground. And I watched firsthand as Gideon and George were trying to make this happen. And it's not just about the money; it's gathering the resource, the science, the thought going into the protocol, and then actually delivering it. It's a monumental effort. And I mean, it was, incredible to, just to be close watching it as I was only very, very peripherally involved. But these guys completely immersed in making this study happen. But then you see the outcome of it. And, it became, the LEAP study was absolutely a landmark trial. It's across the world recognized as, completely changing our understanding of allergy prevention. But to think, that, it was just, a study that happened over the course of a few months. It's so much more than that. But
so is the LEAP study like the OIT?
No. So the LEAP study was the idea that if you introduce an allergen, and in this case, peanut was the example, earlier into the infant weaning diet, you can dramatically reduce the likelihood of becoming allergic. So essentially, they got hundreds of babies who had significant eczema and egg allergy, who we all knew were at high risk of becoming allergic to peanuts. Their risk was about 30%. And then they get randomized to either deliberately avoiding peanut, which at the time was the public health advice in the UK, or deliberately introduced to it regularly from 4 months, so this is sort of before when standard weaning was normally recommended to start, then the kids who had it deliberately introduced into their diet had a dramatically reduced likelihood of developing peanut allergy over the next few years.
Because when I was growing up, my parents used to say, like, try, like, avoid eating peanuts.
Absolutely,
and I
yeah.
got an allergy. So for some kind of parents with kids, if they introduce it very early on when they're weaning, that could stop that,
Massively reduce the risk. And so this completely turned what was conventional wisdom on its head. And it's not often you get studies to do that. And I think what was really unusual about this study was the scale of the effect. I mean, when you do, when you're used to reading medical research, there's a new medicine and it reduces the risk of something by 20% or 30%. That's a huge result. That's going to have a real impact. When you have an intervention that, as it turns out, reduces the risk of peanut allergy, something, a lifelong, potentially life-threatening disease, and it reduces it by 70 to 80%. This is going to, this is important, and that's exactly what came out of it. I mean, public health guidance globally has changed as a result of this study, and it's an enormous privilege to be anywhere close to that type of research, and for that to be essentially sort of the founding research for a new department at a hospital was way beyond anybody's expectations, and it led to a whole research program that's gone on to massively and as a result, research groups around the world being able to build on this to markedly improve the likelihood of reducing allergy risk. And you'll never quantify how many lives that saved or how many lives that's impacted, because you never knew who was going to get it otherwise. But everybody, we all know that this has had a profound effect, which is it's amazing to be part of.
So in regards to obviously setting up your clinic, can we talk a little bit about the treatment? Because even I get confused. There's so many different treatments now. OIT, is this like the main treatment? And can you kind of discuss what that involves and what it is?
Yeah. So for me, the landmark date is always 2006, because that's when we set up the service at St. Thomas's. So I always sort of think, where are we now compared to then? And as a practicing paediatric allergist in 2006, essentially we were seeing children and diagnosing them with allergies and then just crossing our fingers and hoping they went away. That was it. Now, it was still, made a big difference to people that they had proper diagnostics. They really knew what they're allergic to, but the treatment was just avoidance. And make sure they know how to recognize a reaction, carry appropriate emergency medication, use it at the right time in the right way. That's a big job of work in itself. But there was always an underlying frustration that we're a diagnostic specialty rather than a therapeutic specialty. And everybody wants to be a therapeutic specialty. Of course they do. We want to make our patients better. That's what you become a doctor for. And there were only the sort of whispers of this then. And in fact, it was around 2004, 2005 that the first proof of concept papers were coming out from Cambridge, but also from the US, saying, look, there's this treatment that we've been using for allergies to pollen and dust mite, where you give somebody the thing that they're allergic to and it makes them less sensitive, but doing it with food. Now, people had dabbled in this for some time. So in the 1980s, remember that the conventional treatment for pollen allergies were injections of grass pollen. Yeah. And occasionally you'd cause horrendous side effects. The reason you don't get that much in the UK is that between the 50s and the 80s, there were a number of deaths from people being injected with pollen for hay fever. You cannot have a hay fever treatment that might kill you. It's just too risky. So that sort of took a back seat, and now we've got much better ways of doing it by using what's called sublingual immunotherapy, where you put it under your tongue, dramatically safer and very effective as well. But in the 80s and in the US, they were dabbling with, well, what if we inject peanut allergic patients with a little bit of peanut and then increase the amount gradually? And that study did not go well. There were horrendous side effects. And so it sort of got parked, not unreasonably. But then the idea of saying, well, actually, the principle of desensitization, this idea of giving you a little bit and gradually increasing it as a way of making you less sensitive, still holds water. We just need to find a better way of doing it that's not going to cause catastrophic reactions that are worse than the thing you're trying to treat.
So prior, they was probably doing way too much.
Well, injecting it was the bad idea.
Yeah.
Whereas where things moved, and this is what the proof of concept study showed, is that actually you could get a group of people with a peanut allergy who would react when they ate half a peanut. And you could give them small but slowly increasing amounts of peanut over a period of time and get them to the point that they can eat 2 peanuts or 4 peanuts. And that's actually a material amount, because if you explore how much peanut causes most of the reactions you hear about. I mean, in my clinic, and I mean, I have to say there was a world apart between 2006, where nearly every nut allergic patient I saw would tell me what their stories of their reactions each year when I saw them, because they had always had them, because food labeling was terrible and the awareness of nut allergy was terrible. But these days, way less likely. Food labeling's better, awareness is better. So most of my patients with nut allergies will, each year when I see them, they'll say, actually, no, I've not had a reaction this year, which is, great. But unfortunately, the pea allergic ones and the lentil allergic ones, or the egg and milk allergic ones, still really, really hard to avoid. And of course, sometimes when those reactions do happen, they can be awful. But when you look at the amount of allergen that causes them, it's usually small. People don't come in and say, oh, I accidentally ate a peanut butter sandwich. They come in and they say, I went to a restaurant, I told them I was allergic to this, but clearly somebody didn't wash out the pan that had cooked the satay in before they cooked my meal, or somebody used the knife from the peanut butter when they made my sandwich, those sorts of things. So the amount of allergen is usually in the order of, 100, 200 milligrams. So, half a peanut's worth, which means if you can take somebody from being sensitive to a quarter or a half of a peanut to being okay with a couple of peanuts, it might feel like a little bit, but actually it's material. It is life-changing, and it takes so much of the heat out of traveling and eating out and all of those things where you're constantly and rightly worrying, what if I have a tiny little bit of this, to suddenly being in a position where it's, I just need to make sure I don't eat quite a bit of this. Yeah. And it's much more achievable.
It must be incredible to kind of see that mindset. It must be like, from a kid who's really anxious to allergies, to be able then to kind of, definitely when you're a teenager and you start going out with your friends, to be able to kind of eat out and not have that thought in your back of your head. I have it all the time when I meet them out. I'm like, oh my God, is this safe? I heard about someone who had an allergic reaction at Nando's because she had a dairy allergy and they just didn't take it seriously and they put dairy in the wrap. So
it's potentially transformational for the right people, done in the right way at the right time. And that's the key thing, because it's quite a process and it's quite a journey. So this oral immunotherapy, so we refer to it as OIT, it's been a real journey from those proof of concept studies in 2004. And again, things just don't happen that quickly. For many years afterwards, there was a lot of debate. So there was more studies going on, more data coming out, all of it looking pretty reassuring, but showing that you could usually successfully desensitize your patients, but it did carry a risk. And occasionally, as part of the treatment program, kids would have quite significant reactions. So a couple of things started to emerge. The first was that this was clearly more plausible in children than in adults. And that's been shown recurrently through all of the studies, really, that this gets harder to do the older the patient is, and that you're more likely to have reactions, the outcomes aren't as good, and logistically it's harder to do on older patients as well. They have more going on in their lives. Having the doses every day actually is it's not as simple as popping a bit of peanut in your mouth. You have to be rested before, you have to have a period of observation afterwards, so it's quite intrusive into day-to-day life.
Do you ever think it'll ever get to a point where it'll be like a home kit where you could do this yourself?
Well, sort of, yes, really. So I mean, as this has evolved, and, the big thing that happened is in 2021, there was a license for Palforzia. So this is, not great that this sort of became commercialized, in the sense that this was always a treatment that was done with peanut butter or peanut powder or cashew powder or sesame seed with food. But then what happened in the US, and I guess this sort of isn't a big surprise, is a pharmaceutical company essentially sort of picked this up and said, well, let's treat this as a drug rather than as a food. And on the positive side, that company turned peanut powder into very, very carefully measured capsules, so that you can say, right, I'm giving my patient exactly 1 milligram of peanut protein, which is really hard to do otherwise if it's not measured in a really accurate way. Which was helpful in as much as they did a large, pretty global, multi-center randomized controlled trial to be able to demonstrate, actually, this is safe and doable, and here are the things that you need to do to mitigate the risk of allergic reactions, and these are the likely outcomes in the way that you would with a medicine, and consequently get regulatory approval, which means you can actually go to a hospital and say, can we do this treatment? It's got regulatory approval like penicillin or any other medicine, in which case they're way more likely to say yes than you saying, look, I've got this idea, I want to do this stuff with peanuts that might cause catastrophic reactions, but we think it's okay, but there's no regulation around it because it's food. That was enormously helpful. But the downside, inevitably, you get pharmaceutical companies involved, it makes it way more expensive because they have to recoup the cost of all of those huge clinical trials and make their profits and keep their shareholders happy. So, well, there was a lovely article in the a magazine, not a medical magazine, a magazine called The Atlantic in the US, that had a headline along the lines of saying only the American pharmaceutical industry can find a way of making a jar of peanut butter cost $10,000. I'm paraphrasing that a little bit, but essentially it's, you've taken something that you should be able to just deliver with a jar of peanut butter, but suddenly it becomes way more expensive. And in fact, when Palforzia got its license, and it got a UK license, and then it got approved by NICE, which basically means that it's been considered not just effective but cost effective. It did cost thousands of pounds for a course of treatment. But
this is out there now.
Well, this got a NICE approval on the NHS in early 2022, and frustratingly, they put a press release out, just before Christmas that year, saying we're anticipating that we'll be treating hundreds of people on the NHS this year. We'll be treating thousands by next year and subsequent years. And it needed to be 1,000 because they'd worked out that there were 140,000 eligible patients for this treatment. And the community was definitely ready and very excited about it, as were we. And then there was a monumental failure of implementation. And consequently, and this is now 3 or 4 years ago now, we've seen probably barely 100 kids receive this treatment on the NHS. And certainly for me, having had all these years of sort of looking forward to say, because it's not like we didn't see it coming. This didn't suddenly come out of nowhere. Yeah. This was, there are many years where in the medical journals, the consensus was, this is really exciting, this treatment that's coming, but it's not quite ready for rollout because we still need to know more. And then there's a point where you sort of start feeling, wait a minute, are the research guys just saying this isn't ready for rollout yet because they're not going to get research funding once this goes into clinical practice? And then that tension developed. And of course, what happens in the US, where private medicine is dramatically less regulated than it is in the UK, they were just getting on with it. And you have the hospitals, the big hospitals in the US saying, we're not sure if this is quite ready to go and we maybe need to do some more research, and this is the big academic centers. And then you had private practitioners in the US being able to publish case reports of hundreds of cases that they're done. Yeah. There was, I've got colleagues in the US who will tell me that they've been doing OIT and other treatments for food allergy for 15 years now. Whereas this is something that was all pretty new to us.
New in the background. Yeah. How much does it then cost for like a parent who does want to do OIT? Do the NHS pay that, or is it private?
Yeah. Well, if you go through if you're lucky enough to get Palforzia on the NHS, you're not going to pay for it. But the problem is access. And there are, long waiting lists in the relatively small number of centres that have been able to offer it. And most of the centres, certainly in the north of the country, when they put business cases forward to their commissioners, so what are called the ICBs, the Integrated Care Boards, who are responsible for paying for the provision of these treatments, they were knocked back and told, we just haven't got the money for this. And you look at some of these services, and I think allergy services across the NHS, which is something I've been banging on about for a long time. They're barely managing to service just the basic needs of the referred population, just getting people in and getting their diagnosis. Trying to, on top of that, say, well, actually, for everybody with one of these allergies, we're going to find enough resource. And it's not just the money, it's the space, it's the trained staff, it's those things really which are the blockers. That for each kid with one of these allergies, we're going to find an additional 10 visits on a daycare unit to deliver this treatment. That doesn't feel very practical at the moment because everything is and has been for some years, is being sort of pulled back in the NHS. It's like, how do you manage to do just what you've been trying to do but with less resource? Not how do you make this massive transformation from being a diagnostic specialty to a therapeutic specialty? And I think that's when that sort of had a real impact on me, because what we'd achieved at St Thomas's is we had really sort of stayed cutting edge. And we're able to offer everything that we wanted to. Sublingual immunotherapy, these new treatments for pollen and dust mite allergies, we've been able to offer them through the hospital, even though there was very limited available elsewhere. But it became clear that this was going to be really hard to roll out in the NHS, and that even if we were able to, it was going to be on a very small scale that didn't come close to meeting demand. And I think it was at that point where myself and colleagues thought, we can't have, and it's not even, speculative. We're at the point where we had licensed treatments for treating food allergy, but we had no way of our patients accessing them. And that's where we felt, well, look, you can take two views here. You can either say, well, if everybody can't have them, nobody should get them, which is never something I've bought into, or say, well, at least let's set this up in the private sector, so at least somebody can get it. But you drag the specialty forward. If I've always felt that if we're able to demonstrate that we can do this in the private sector, it becomes much harder to justify not doing it on the NHS sector, especially when you're using licensed treatments and treatments that are increasingly being used all over the world as what's becoming standard of care, and demonstrate, look, you can do this in a UK setting. And yes, it's not right that this is only available in the private sector, but this is a really key driver to show that we need to get our act together on the NHS side of things as well.
And with your clinic, is it just children, or are you looking at like adults? I mean, I'm 32 now.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this.
Have I passed my expiry date?
No, you absolutely haven't. And I think this is where things are getting increasingly exciting, because what's happened with this completely different approach to food allergy, of thinking of it as this is a condition that we can treat, is it's opened up loads of angles. And of course, there's the obvious gap, because the way the wind has blown with oral immunotherapy is it's blown towards younger children. And that's because when you desensitize a younger child, especially in infancy, soon after diagnosis, your chances of actually being able to get them to reintroduce that food fully back into their diet, not just being able to eat a little bit more than they could of it, which is what you might only achieve with a teenager, it's very realistic in younger children. And very, picking up these kids at diagnosis, getting straight on with immunotherapy, most of them will, within a couple of years, just be eating that food freely. So we don't call it a cure, because they're reliant on having it regularly in their diet to maintain an effect, but their life becomes much more normal. You can take their emergency medication off them. They can eat that food freely. So the fact that you can do that in young kids, of course, everybody's focused on that. And inevitably in clinical practice, for me, it's become incredibly important to get kids from diagnosis to treatment as quickly as possible. But then there's this enormous demand of people who have just been living with allergies like yourself, and it's really important that they're not forgotten. And last year, I'm sure this definitely wouldn't have been lost on you, a very close colleague of mine, Stephen Till, published the grown-up peanut immunotherapy study, essentially saying, wait a minute, we can do this in grown-ups, and it works. And you're not going to get people free eating peanuts, but and it's always peanut, and that's just because it's the model, but it works, equally in other nuts and sesame and things like that as well. But actually you can get really sort of, big effects, meaningful effects for older people.
Because I've seen an article on BBC of a guy similar age to me, I think, and he was like, oh yeah, I'm eating peanuts now.
Yeah,
I did the
treatment, that's right.
And I was just like, because you never really see it with adults, so it really surprised me.
And that was all immunotherapy done pretty much in exactly the same way that we're doing it in kids, but it requires careful supervision, because sometimes they can have really significant reactions. So it's not for everybody. Some people, they're just too nervous to do it.
But with someone my age, I would have thought I would have to do it private. I doubt the NHS.
Yeah, there's no.
They're
Yeah,
going to turn around and say, "Well, you've managed it now for 32 years.
Yeah.
Why would we?"
I mean, regardless of that, at the moment, there's just nothing. There's just no provision for it. It's not. And again, I think the specialty, adult allergy specialty, just I don't think it's in a very good place to be able to do this at scale. So there's clinical trials. That's one way of getting access, but I don't think we're going to see a big rollout of this. And the reason I don't think is just that I think it's been superseded by the newer treatments that are coming out, because alongside this, huge interest in oral immunotherapy, we've been routinely treating people with allergies to grass and tree pollen and dust mite with sublingual immunotherapy, where you just put a little tablet that contains the allergen under the tongue, and it's really effective for respiratory allergy. So some years ago, somebody had the bright idea of saying, well, what if you do that with peanut? Now, the benefit of this is that the dose that you use is way smaller than the dose that you actually get somebody to eat as part of their treatment program, which means the chances of you causing a severe reaction are way, way less as part of your treatment program. But remarkably, it still seems to work. Oh, wow. Slower and with less of an effect, but it still works. Now, one of the big downsides
What
of
treatment is this?
so this is called sublingual immunotherapy.
Okay.
So this is where you get the allergen, so peanut, for example, and it goes under your tongue. Now, you start with a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit, and you hold it there for a minute or two each day, and then after a couple of weeks, you slightly increase the dose.
Is this something your clinic does, or is it?
Well, it's something we're hoping to introduce quite soon, but it's something that's inevitably caught the eye of the pharmaceutical industry again. Of course, yeah. And so there are what we call phase 2 clinical trials going on, looking at the efficacy of this, which is great because we want the data and the evidence, before it's rolled out. I've got a little conflict of interest to declare because I'm an independent safety monitor for a clinical trial looking very specifically at this. But there's a fair bit of data out there already and showing that this works. But interestingly, in the US, there's a huge amount of clinical experience. So again, there's guys in the private sector who've been doing this for donkey's years. And so they can actually say, well, in my 15 years experience of offering sublingual immunotherapy for food, this is what we found. So, I mean, it's, that's not just anecdotal. Yeah. It's not published in the way that we want with clinical trials. And it's great that those are happening. But for a treatment that does look very much like it's safe, then it sort of raises the question, well, should we be getting on with this? Because is it fair to deny people like yourself a treatment when we might not have all the evidence we need to completely understand it? But if we can see that it's safe and it seems to work, maybe it's something we need to discuss with our patients. And, for me, I think as long as people are fully informed that, actually the evidence base for sublingual immunotherapy is not as big, as wide, as deep as it is for oral immunotherapy. But if oral immunotherapy isn't for you, because every day when you have a dose on oral immunotherapy, certainly at the beginning of your program, less so as it goes on for longer, you have to be well rested when you have your dose. You have to essentially not do anything that puts your heart rate up for a good couple of hours on a daily basis. Well, that's enormously intrusive, not for a 1-year-old, but for a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old, it is.
Why the heart rate? Why?
Because that increases your sensitivity to the allergen and makes you more likely to react. So if you are having your dose of, oral immunotherapy starts by having a dose under supervision. So if we were to give you a 20 milligram dose of peanut protein, and you sit nice and quietly in our facility under close observation for an hour or two and you're fine, we then have to say, we'll go home and have the same dose every day for the next 2 weeks and then come back and we'll give you a bigger dose. But if you were to go home and have that same dose the next day and then have a good run around, go for a jog just after your dose, you'll react to that dose because it reduces your threshold. Exercise does that, and it could be a bad reaction. So it's not supposed to be an endurance test of having reactions every day. You're meant to be tolerating your dose.
As if you wanted to go to the gym or...
Exactly. Now, start introducing that into your life and suddenly this doesn't look like such an attractive treatment. But as I said, not a big deal if you're 2 because you aren't desperate to get down the gym and you can just organise your life around quiet periods in the day where you can have your dose. But as the kids get older, it can become more intrusive. Still manageable for most, but intrusive. So if we said, well, actually, we've got an alternative to this where you're way less likely to have a reaction to the treatment and you don't need to do the exclusion period before and after the dose, you're going to be thinking, well, give me that treatment. Now, the problem with that...
How long does it usually take with it? Is it like a couple of months?
Right. You see, now this is where this there's always a punchline. Yeah. So whereas with oral immunotherapy, if you were to go through a program, typically you're looking at 4 to 5 months before we'd get you to the point that you can eat a couple of peanuts. With sublingual immunotherapy, you're looking for a year or even maybe 2 years before we'd give you a decent chance of being able to eat 1 peanut. And in the pipeline, very, very soon coming out, is something called epicutaneous immunotherapy. So this is a peanut patch that predominantly shown on kids rather than adults, but putting the patch on every day for a year or so will give you an effect where you'll be able to eat more peanut on a regular basis. But again, it takes longer and it's a more modest effect, but it's safer and it's less intrusive into your life. So we've now got, it's incredible for me to be able to say this. We've now got this menu of options. We had nothing a few years ago. Now it's, this certainly, has a huge impact in my consultations day to day because you've got to talk through all of this with all of our patients. And there's a lot of what we refer to as shared decision making because some things are right for some people and some things are right for other people. And for some people, the right thing is to not do any of this. Yeah. This is great for us to be able to offer genuine personalized medicine because everybody's got their own different sort of experiences and expectations and priorities. And we've now got all these different options and matching those two things together it takes time, and it's got to be done really carefully, because if you put the kids that aren't right for these treatments through the wrong treatments, it's just a miserable experience. Whereas if you get it right, it can be a fantastic experience and hugely positive.
A bit like the nicotine patch then, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But just over the course of years.
Yeah.
So within, like, say by the end of that first year, or even 6 months into the treatment, you did accidentally come in contact with your allergy, it might be less severe.
That's right. You might already have developed a higher threshold for reaction. And even if you do react because you have more than your threshold and a reaction happens, it might be a less severe reaction than otherwise would have been. And that's really hard to quantify. The only way you can really understand that is large-scale randomized controlled trials. And they're extraordinarily expensive. They're hard to do. They take a long time. And hence, nothing's happening quickly. But then alongside it, with all of this whole new world of different options of immunotherapy, patches and sublingual and oral, there's also a completely different class of medicine that is attracting rightly an enormous amount of interest in the area, which is what we call biologics. So these medicines where, in the US, one of these medicines has a full license for treatment of food allergy. So essentially an injection that if you have it, and you have to have it on a regular basis, in the right patients, it can markedly reduce their sensitivity. And it's agnostic. And what I mean by that is you don't have the jab for peanut allergy or for egg allergy. It's whatever you're allergic to. It makes you less sensitive, but not everybody. And so you have to, be careful, because the last thing you want, the worst of all worlds is a regular injection that makes you think you're less sensitive, but you're not. So you start changing your behavior, and then actually you're more at risk. So, it's not just a matter of saying, here's your jab, off you go, don't worry, you're way less likely to have an accidental reaction. Instead, you have to very carefully assess how effective it's been in you as an individual to see how you can modify your behavior. So this medicine's called Xolair, is the trade name. Omalizumab is the medical name. It's anything ending in mab is a monoclonal antibody. So it's what we call a biologic. So it's an antibody that basically sticks to allergic antibodies and stops them from working very well. So again, for the right patients, it can make them way safer in their day-to-day life. But it's really expensive. And it's not licensed in the UK. It's licensed in the US, which means if you're insured, you could get it and you can just stay on it. And if you've got loads of different food allergies, which would make immunotherapy not very practical, or you're already in your, in your 20s or 30s, you've missed that boat, then, this is a real game changer. And, for the right people, it can be hugely effective and transformational. And the nice thing is it seems to be a very safe and well-tolerated medicine. And we're not saying that based off, a little bit of experience. This medicine was used for severe asthma 20 years ago. In fact, it comes off patent now, which means that we're going to see a load of what we call biosimilars, which are essentially the same thing or broadly the same thing, that can get an approval to show that they're biologically equivalent and potentially will be a lot cheaper. So suddenly this becomes much more of an option. And in the UK, we're not really often using it as a medicine on its own for people with lots of food allergies, because very few people can afford to be on it all the time. But what we are doing is we're using it alongside immunotherapy for patients so that they go on it for 4 to 6 months if they're super sensitive and they've proven very difficult to desensitize. Or we want to do immunotherapy, but they've got 4 different allergens, and to do that one after the other is going to take a long time. So doing all of those, much more bullishly all together in one go alongside being on this medicine, so that it becomes manageable in a way that it wouldn't be if you weren't on that medicine, because you just have reactions all the time. So, combining these different treatment modalities has led to even more options. So again, sort of even more sort of ways of thinking about it. And it just opens things up a little bit it does, particularly for patients who previously would have said, well, oral immunotherapy isn't going to be right for you because you've just got too many different food allergies, or you're so sensitive that we can't even get you on a starting dose because you react at the tiniest doses we can measure, or you keep having really severe reactions on the treatment. For all of those kids, the fact that we've got these biologics to potentially run alongside it potentially opens up a door. Again, not right for everybody. It's an intense, but for some people, and it's, these are intensive courses of treatment. It's regular injections every couple of weeks sometimes, which for some patients is a really big deal that they just don't want to go through.
Are you using much kind of AI within your kind of work now? I know everybody seems to be
it's the buzzword for
AI.
everything.
Yeah, it's the buzzword. I remember I spoke to a doctor out in I think California who used AI to kind of treat people's allergies and data. What's your thoughts on that?
So there's some interesting approaches. So what you're alluding to is something called SoCal, which is a food allergy institute in California, and I've visited there. I spent quite a bit of time there. They were very, 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 very welcoming. I was giving a talk in Los Angeles, and that's where they're based. And they took me around the whole day, showed me all their facilities. It was an incredibly well-run place. I mean, hugely impressive from a purely sort of business perspective. As is often the case in the US, I think the challenge there is the methodology that they're using. So what they're doing is a type of immunotherapy. It's clearly adapted. They have algorithms that they tell us are based on AI, looking at huge amounts of diagnostic data that they gather on all of their patients, that then informs the protocols that they use. And it's still the principles of oral immunotherapy. They're giving kids the doses of the thing that they're allergic to, but they'll start their treatment by using foods that aren't quite the one that they're allergic to, but are similar to that. And that's quite a novel and different approach to what's done elsewhere. And there's very little published on that. And a lot of what they're doing is sort of kept as a proprietary treatment, which means it's hard to apply any scrutiny in the way that normally what would happen, when new treatments come out, they publish all their methodology and it gets reproduced in other centers to confirm that it did the same thing in a different setting, and everybody knows exactly how it works. And they say that when you read a medical paper or a scientific article, you should be able to reproduce what they did from that. But we're not in a position to be able to reproduce what they do because it relies on these very, very complex algorithms that are in a little bit of a black box. So it's hard to know. And so you can only
doing that in the sense that obviously they're kind of trying to patent that this is our method approach.
I wouldn't attempt to speculate on that, but they're sort of running in parallel rather than working together with the more mainstream allergy community. I think that's fair to say. They have allergists involved for sure, but there isn't a complete sort of consensus in the US about whether this is or isn't the right way to do things. And
in general, or just kind of like the US clinics align with like the UK?
Yeah, increasingly so. I mean, over the last few years, as we've started to do more oral immunotherapy, there's been a quite rapid convergence. The protocols that we use in our own centre are very much based on Canadian protocols that have been in use for some time. There's a global community of people who do oral immunotherapy. There's 2 or 3 guys in the US who some time ago said, this is an emerging treatment that doesn't rely on drugs, it relies on food, which means that we need different ways of having governance over this, because we don't have the FDA in a way that they would, as a regulator, would govern the way that we use medicines. So we need our own community to support each other and develop each other's practice and share our knowledge and information. And that's something called the FAST group, the Food Allergy Support Team, that's now become 100 strong in the US. And we've joined that. A number of us from the UK have joined that. There's clinicians from all over the world joining it. So it's a lovely collaborative community that, if you're able to post on the group, I've got a patient with a really unusual allergy to pumpkin seeds. Does anybody have a protocol for desensitizing to pumpkin seed so I don't have to work it all out myself in my clinic and possibly get it wrong? So it's lovely that there's a really open sense of collaboration there, as there should be. And consequently, what we're doing here and what we're doing there is becoming much more closely aligned. But there are some quite fundamental differences. One is, of course, US medicine, because of things like, these biologics that are covered by insurance are way more available. So they're going to be used a lot more in a way that is never going to happen here, because they're just not affordable in the same way. And even when the biosimilars come out, they'll be cheaper, but they need to be a lot cheaper. And that's not going to happen. But also there's a little bit of a mentality in the US towards getting people to much higher doses of food. So there's 2 sort of approaches to immunotherapy as to what you want to achieve. And in the UK, and this I think draws very much from the Canadian history here, has very much been about trying to get what we call bite protection. And the vast majority of our patients, when we say to them, what would you rather do? Go through a longer and more arduous process so that you can eat a peanut butter sandwich? Or would you just like to be at a point where you can stop worrying about accidental peanut contamination? But we're way more likely to be able to get you there, and it's going to be much less of a journey to achieve that. Most patients will say, we just want the bite protection. because that's what's making our lives harder. It's not that we desperately want to eat a peanut butter sandwich. Whereas in the US, it's always been, we're going to get you to the point that you can eat a peanut butter sandwich. So whereas in the UK, you know, we might bring a 4-year-old in and give them small but increasing doses over 4 months, so about 8 visits, to the point that they can eat a couple of peanuts. In the US, they would do those 8 visits and then continue 2 weekly visits for months longer until they can eat 4,000 milligrams, so the equivalent of 25 peanuts, so that they can then eat a peanut butter sandwich.
What's your thoughts on like people with allergies and like may contain? Should they avoid it completely? I know it's different for everyone. I know for me personally, I try avoiding it, but I thought it'd be great to, if a person comes to yourself, what's your kind of thoughts around that?
Well, there's an enormous caveat at the beginning, which is, you know, this is not advice that is blanket. You have to, you can't treat somebody who's got an egg allergy but can eat baked egg but has had a history of mild reactions to plain egg the same as the child who's landed up on intensive care 4 times because they've had tiny exposures to milk or peanut. You know, those aren't the same kids, so you can't give the same advice. But broadly, I always suggest risk assessment, which is of course what we do all day, every day in our day-to-day lives. Every time you cross the road, every time you go in a car, you are risk assessing. You know, do you put a crash helmet on? You don't when you get in your car, but you do when you get on a motorbike, those sorts of things. And you should be applying similar things to food allergies. So for most people, my advice would be that you need to think about 3 things. Are you physically well at the time? Because if you're not, if you've got a cold or you're under the weather, you are going to be more sensitive. You'll react to a smaller amount of whatever you're allergic to, and you're more likely to have a bad reaction. Do you have your medicine with you? Do you have the means to deal with a significant reaction where it's happened? Are you carrying your Jext or your EpiPen, or from next week we can say your neffy?
I'd love to talk about that.
Absolutely,
well.
I knew you were going to want to talk about that. And then the third thing is, what's your access to help? You know, are you visiting a friend in rural Norfolk and there's no way any ambulance is getting to you in the space of 2 hours? Or are you in a, you know, urban setting where there's a very reasonable expectation that within 5 minutes help's going to be there? And take all of those 3 things into account. And I think for somebody who doesn't, you know, isn't a patient who has a history of very severe or reacting to very, very trace amounts, I think it's reasonable that if you're well, you have your medication to hand with somebody who knows how to use it, and you could expect help to come in a sensible time frame. It's not unreasonable to have things that say may contain.
Because obviously when you eat out in restaurants, it always says, we can't guarantee any of this food is like, and people just don't eat out at restaurants. I'm like, no. Yeah. I mean, it's really hard because obviously it's from everyone's experience and what they're allergic to. But I with an allergy, always eat out in restaurants.
Yeah. And I think, look, you know, one of the most fascinating things I've found about being an allergist is how profoundly differently different families will manage the same problem. You know, if you get a child with a food allergy and put them in 10 different families, you'll get 10 completely different ways of dealing with it. And they vary from, you know, what I would describe as unnecessarily overprotective. You know, the kids who are homeschooled because of their food allergies. And I'm not saying that's, you know, that might be the right thing for some families, but sometimes you think, do you know what, this doesn't have to be like this. And sometimes when you dig into it, it's born of a misunderstanding of the level of risk. And that's, you know, that's a real failing on the part of them, of the doctors looking after them, that they've been left to sort of work it out themselves and come to sometimes not the best conclusions that aren't necessarily accurate, to some people who are completely overly laissez-faire and are recurrently feeding their child the thing that they're allergic to just to see what happens because they think it might get better if they do. You know, I get families who have cooked up their own forms of home immunotherapy and caused all, you know, things that you think, my God, seriously, are you doing this? Which is why you'll always hear when we talk about immunotherapy, always saying, do not just do this at home. You know, this is something that needs to be done carefully.
I didn't even know if that was a thing. I mean, that's crazy.
You know, people doing all sorts of things. Typically they're doctors, the parents, who have a crack at doing it themselves. And then they come to you when they've realised it's not going as it should. To some people who just are an absolute inspiration, that they've just managed it so sensibly, you know, just applied really solid common sense to managing things so that they're able to maximize what they do, but not take unnecessary risks, and everything in between. So it's there isn't a right thing for everybody. There's some things that just won't work for some families. Some families are too chaotic. Other families are just too anxious to do certain things. So, for me, that's the joy of of what makes the job interesting. It's dealing with different families and understanding them as individuals, and then thinking, okay, how can we apply what we know to what will work for them? And then being open to sort of sometimes getting it wrong and changing it and having an ongoing conversation.
Do you get a lot of parents quite anxious when obviously their kids turn into teenagers and then
that creates the enormous, because we all look at human nature, we all like a bit of control, and I think people feel that when their children are younger they can control things. Their children are going to nut-free schools, or whenever they are out there's a parent there, but then of course the kids get older, they're going out without them, they push back, they want to rebel, and they're doing all sorts of things which cause an enormous amount of anxiety. But then you also get an enormous amount of children themselves who become very, very anxious teenagers because of their anxiety about food. And I think I always think that for myself. I always think I'm not super anxious, but I do feel like sometimes does my anxiety probably play a part in other areas of my life as well? And I'm pretty sure it does in some aspects. And I think, look, there's a lot of people have a tendency towards anxiety, and if you're an anxious person with a food allergy, inevitably a lot of that anxiety is then going to start hanging on that food allergy. And I think one thing we've not done well in this country, and we've got a lot to learn from the US in particular, is a recognition of this and involvement of psychologists in the care of people with allergies. And you can't just go to a psychologist and say, look, I've got multiple food allergy, help me, because they often don't really understand how anxious you should be. Because it's not like, I worry about the end of the world, because you just have to say, well, look, we're going to have to find strategies so that you don't worry about this so much. But when you've got a genuinely potentially life-threatening medical condition, you do have to worry a little bit, because you have to worry appropriately to keep yourself safe. So, we're very lucky. For many years at St Thomas's, we were able to get specialist psychologists developing their understanding of allergy, working specifically with allergy patients, to become genuinely specialist allergy psychologists. But there's nothing like enough of them. But they can add an enormous amount of value. And if you go to a good allergy clinic in the US with multiple food allergy, they would routinely connect you with an allergy psychologist, because of course you'll benefit from the whole family getting that sort of support and coping strategies from somebody who understands food allergy.
I wouldn't leave this podcast on a final note without talking about neffy, because I think last time I had you on in 2023, we talked about the auto injector and how it's not changed, and I was like, when is someone else going to come along? And then neffy's come along now. Can we talk about that? Because obviously I saw kind of studies to say that it's 89% as effective as the EpiPen in terms of the second dose.
Yeah, so this is exciting, because it's for some people, this is going to be a real game changer. I've got a number of patients who they'll say to me, they've got severe food allergies, they carry their EpiPens, but they'll say, I'm not going to use it because I'm too scared of the needle. Now, we need another option for them. And so essentially this is the same medicine but delivered in a different way. And what that means in practice is that when you want to get regulatory approval, you don't have to go through quite the same hurdles. You just have to demonstrate what's called bioequivalence. You have to be able to show that the same amount of medicine gets into you in broadly the same time frame as if you were to give an intramuscular injection of adrenaline, not compared to the other treatments available like an EpiPen. So the bioequivalence of neffy was used. They just had to demonstrate that if you drew up a syringe with adrenaline and injected it into your muscle, which is what they'll do in hospital if you need adrenaline for an allergic reaction, that broadly the curve of adrenaline uptake in the blood looks about the same, and it does, and hence it got its regulatory approval. Interestingly, EpiPens perform a little bit better than giving a regular injection of adrenaline, and the adrenaline seems to get in a little bit faster and the peak is a little bit quicker. But the real question, of course, is, well, what does this look like in the field? What you really need to know is what happens when you treat people with who are having anaphylaxis, not the healthy volunteers that were used in order to show the equivalence of these medicines. It's what happens when you actually use it on people with anaphylaxis. And the amount of data on that was pretty limited. Although bear in mind that neffy's now been licensed in the US for about a year, so there would be a lot of, they're looking very carefully for safety signals that would suggest that it doesn't perform as well. Now, look, there's firstly, you've got to think there's an argument. If we're saying, what if neffy, when you use that and squirt the adrenaline up your nose, what if it takes a couple of minutes longer for that to get into your system in a meaningful way than if you were to give yourself an injection. Well, if you're somebody who's saying, I'm really not going to use my adrenaline injector because I'm so frightened of needles, you could say, well, they're still going to get adrenaline in their system quicker by squirting up their nose than not using their EpiPen for 5 minutes before somebody has to do it for them because they won't do it themselves. So you've got to take a pragmatic view on that. But there's also an assumption in there that the timing and the peak of adrenaline in some way is directly relatable to how effective it is as a treatment. So we've got to be careful there. So do we know exactly how it performs compared to an EpiPen? No one will only know when there's been a huge amount of use over a long period of time. No amount of sort of studies will compete with 40 years of legacy use, which is what EpiPens have got. However, quite reassuring that a study that came out where a few hundred practices were sent these neffy devices in the US, and about 500 of them were used in people who were having severe reactions. And what they showed is that only about 10% of people needed a second dose 5 minutes later, which is pretty much the same as if you would have done this, what you would have expected if you did the same study with an EpiPen. But sorry, I'm going to just quickly. But then it comes down to, well, what were the nature of these reactions? And unless you've got a huge amount of data about, well, how bad were these reactions, and were, some people use these pretty early. And remember, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but people are likely to use their neffy much earlier because it's not an injection, and they're much more, some people are going to be much more open saying, well, I think my reaction's getting bad. And we always say to people when they're carrying their Jext or their EpiPen, if you think it's a bad reaction, just use your pen. But we know a lot of them will hesitate because they just do, whereas they probably don't so much, or maybe they don't, with a neffy, which means that we could be comparing apples and oranges here and comparing milder reactions with more severe reactions, and then saying, oh, look, both of them only need a 10%, second dose, when actually that could mean something quite different for the milder reactions. So, it's going to take time till we've got complete confidence. So I'm not going to sort of, I think it would be silly to say, fantastic, let's wholesale change everybody from their injectors that we know are fit for purpose and have been working well for 40 years for something that's new. But for some people, it needs a conversation. A neffy is going to be the right device. It is smaller, it's more portable, it's got a longer shelf life. There's other benefits, but on an individual basis, we need to decide what's the right device for you in the context of what we know so far. But then also remembering that we need to train people how to use this new device. No point giving it out to people and then not knowing what to do with it. Likewise,
can we talk about how you use it? Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward. I mean, I should have bought a dummy one with me, but literally you stick it up your nose and press.
But it's the same amount of adrenaline as...
It's not going to be quite the same amount, but it's the amount to give a biologically equivalent dose that gets into your system. Now, at the moment, it's only available in the higher dose, so it's 2 milligrams neffy, equivalent to an adult EpiPen or an adult Jext, so 300 microgram EpiPen or Jext. Next year, we'll see the smaller dose come out, which will be for the kids under 30 kilos. So for now, it's 30 kilos and over. But I think it's going to have, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. It's, there are a lot of people who are just really keen to get them. And then I think when they suddenly realize, but wait a minute, if I take this to school, no one in the school is going to know how to use this. There's going to have to be a little bit of pause about, well, it's not just about that you can use this. What about the other people that might be responsible for you that are going to, there's going to take time for this to, it's been quite a journey getting everybody in school familiar with using Jext and EpiPens. This is now an additional device. And, how do you feel about carrying a device that if it's not you that's going to give it, is somebody else just going to look at it and think, I have no idea what this is? Whereas they would have known what an EpiPen or a Jext was. So there's still there's a training gap, there's a knowledge gap, there's the awareness thing, So there's a lot of those things that we need to bear in mind before we just start giving this out to people. And I think it's going to be, it's going to be a journey. And as always, there's be some people it's great for and others it's not.
I know it's FDA approved.
It's FDA approved. It's got its MHRA approval. Supply is, today is the 2nd of October. Yeah. It's, my understanding is that we'll have it in stock between the 6th and the 8th of October. So we are literally on the cusp of having this. Yeah. It was sort of technically launched a week or two ago, but there's always, the supply has to then actually reach the shelves. then getting it on the NHS, individual hospitals and GP surgeons have to put it on their formulary, and that can take different lengths of time depending on what their processes are. So this isn't going to there's not going to be a big bang and it's going to be everywhere. This will take time to roll out.
I think one of my final questions before we go is, obviously neffy is going to come out very soon, but just like you say, it's different for everyone, but obviously it's up to you whether you don't jump the boat straight away, maybe see how people get on with it first before they kind of decide,
my plan is to have conversations with people and make sure they understand, the potential challenges that this brings, make sure that, they know exactly how and when to use it and that they still need to give a second dose 5 minutes later. I know there'll be families, they'll say, well, why don't we just carry both? And that's what you're doing is you're then risking introducing confusion at a time when you need to be as not confused as possible. There's all these, people say a lot of things about using these devices. You have to keep it as simple as possible, because the important stuff is that people use it early and they give a second one 5 minutes later if they're not better. And the more different instructions you give them around that, the more likely there is that the message gets confused and the basic things don't happen well.
And say if I thought I was having an allergic reaction, obviously we've spoke about this previously, but for anyone who's not listened to the first podcast, there's no harm to using adrenaline.
No, look, the lovely thing about adrenaline is it's a very safe medicine when it's given by either the nasal or the intramuscular route, which means that, as we say to people, if you're not sure if your reaction is bad enough, just give it. You'll never be sorry that you gave it.
Would you still have to go to hospital afterwards?
Well, at the moment, yeah. I mean, there's the rule is if you've given it, you should be assessed by a medical professional. You should be calling an ambulance and making sure somebody's getting a proper look at you. And that very much is what I'd advocate. And that's not because of the effect of the adrenaline. It's because of the underlying reaction that you need assessment. The ideal, of course, is that the ambulance arrives to find you sitting up looking absolutely fine because the adrenaline's worked. And that will often be the case.
Yeah, I think I spoke last time where I used it and it probably wasn't an allergic reaction. Yeah. It's funny because I was so anxious, but then I used it and I was like, I feel great. Like, it was like, fine, my legs up in the air. And by the time they come and took all the tests, I was like, no, we don't think it was a reaction. Maybe you were just panicking yourself.
But I'm involved with a group of other specialists, predominantly Americans, looking at that advice and trying to come up with some sensible and evidence-based advice about when it might be appropriate to use your adrenaline and not call an ambulance, because of course it adds a monumental amount of hassle and unnecessary visits to hospital, which have all lots of downsides as well. And I think they're more focused in the US on that because they'll have to pay for those visits. But likewise, sitting 6 hours in A&E is not a joy in the UK either. So coming up with a sensible framework of saying, well, if you've had a reaction that only had certain features and it's completely responded to your first round of adrenaline, and you've got a second round with you if you needed it, and somebody with you to keep an eye on you, and a load of other factors, you don't have any other risk factors, it's reasonable to not call for help and just wait and watch. And I think that's going to be something that we'll see happening over the next few years, sort of development of guidance around that, which I think will be a really positive thing. And especially because we've now got a growing army of people who are deliberately giving their dose of the thing that they're allergic to at home as part of immunotherapy programs. Yeah. And is it appropriate for all of them every time they use it to need, is there a way of keeping them at home rather than them having completely unnecessarily hospital visits?
That's amazing. Honestly, it's been incredible to have you on the podcast again. And it's been really interesting to hear about all the different treatments now. I feel like every year you hear about a new treatment. And
there's more coming. Yeah. There's such exciting stuff coming. There's sublingual adrenaline coming out in the next year or two. So another way of using adrenaline. There's whole new modalities of treatment for food allergy. It's an exciting time.
Amazing. And if anyone wants to follow yourself, Adam, on your kind of social media, would you like to share?
Yes, I'm at Dr. Adam Fox, Dr. Adam Fox. So I do my best to just post interesting stuff about allergies.
Amazing. Thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.